Obese orphan girl, auctioned for labor. Mountain man said, she's my precious treasure. $5 for 3 years' labor, Mother Superior Agnes intoned, the words dropping like stones into the cold hall of St. Agatha's. Benches creaked, boots scraped, and the smell of wet wool and tallow pressed against the walls. On the auction block stood Rosalind O'Brien, Rose, 19, wrapped in a frayed gray dress that could not hide broad hips or the tremor in her hands. Girls in younger rows stared at their laps. Men in rough coats smirked. $2 then, Agnes said, impatience sharpening her tongue. One? Silence. It rang louder than jeers. Rose lifted her chin because pride was the last thing the orphanage had not taken. She could weather the whispers. She eats more than she works, slow as molasses. She had heard worse. But the emptiness where a bid should be felt like a verdict written by God himself, unwanted at any price. If no one will take her, Agnes announced, savoring the words, she will be dismissed at once to make her own way. The rear door blew inward on a gust of snow. A man filled the doorway, a storm at his back, bearskin coat, heavy with frost, shoulders broad enough to block the wind. He stepped inside, shut the cold out with one hand, and let his voice roll through the hall. $1,000? Heads snapped toward him. Even candles seemed to pause their flicker. He walked the aisle with the patience of a mountain, set a leather sack on the table where the ledger lay, and looked up at Rose as though there were no one else in Bitter Creek. For her freedom, he said, not a lease, not a term, freedom. Agnes's mouth opened and closed, a fish on dry land. Sir, this is irregular. The stranger's gaze did not move. Nathaniel Thornfield, men call me Bear. He drew a knife, not to threaten, but to slice the coarse twine at Rose's wrists. The rope fell. Warmth flooded fingers she had forgotten were hers. You are not property, he told her quietly, as if the statement itself could mend bones. If you wish to leave, you walk out that door beside me, a free woman. The hall held its breath. The gavel hovered, useless. Outside, snow whispered against the eaves, waiting to see which life she would choose. Rosalind O'Brien had grown used to being invisible, except when someone needed a scapegoat. Too large for the convent's hand-me-down dresses, too slow to keep up with the younger children, too soft-hearted to harden herself against the cruelty of others, she had become the orphanage's burden. The girls whispered that she ate too much. The boys mocked her clumsy steps, and the nuns, especially Mother Agnes, reminded her daily that she was a mouth without worth. At 19, Rose's childhood had already slipped away, but no one had ever given her the dignity of adulthood. She scrubbed floors until her knees bled, cooked stews she was never allowed to taste, and kept the fires alive through bitter nights when her own bed had no blanket. Each kindness she showed to the littlest children, to the sickly lamb in the stable, was dismissed as weakness. By the time of the labor auction, she had come to believe it herself, that she was destined to be unwanted, a girl too heavy, too plain, too much. Nathaniel Thornfield, Bear, was a man built for solitude, though he had not always chosen it. He stood a full head taller than most men, shoulders broad enough to carry timber alone. Years of hunting had left his face weathered, his beard thick, and his eyes the startling green of pine needles in winter sun. Half a life ago, he had marched as a soldier, buried his comrades, and turned his back on towns that spoke of freedom while dealing chains. For 20 years, He had worked his ranch high on Whitehorn Mountain, a place of roaring fires, strong horses, and silence unbroken but for the wolves. The people of Bitter Creek spoke of him in low tones, half respect, half fear. Some called him a recluse, others whispered he was dangerous. Few knew the truth, that he carried loneliness like a scar no one could see. When Bear stepped into the orphanage hall and offered a fortune not to own Rose but to free her, the town witnessed something they did not understand. Why would a mountain man spend $1,000 on a girl no one else would take for one? But Rose, trembling as the ropes fell from her wrists, saw no mockery in his eyes, only a kind of fierce certainty, as if he had found something precious the world had been too blind to notice. And when he offered his hand, roughened by winters and work, she found herself reaching for it, the first step out of a life of scorn and into a future she could not yet name. Snow fell thick and heavy as Nathaniel led Rose out of Bitter Creek. The sack of gold was gone, but in its place he carried something weightier, the trembling hand of a girl who had never before been given a choice. He lifted her onto the seat of his wagon as though she were porcelain, not a burden, then wrapped a woolen blanket around her shoulders. The road out of town was silent save for the crunch of iron wheels on snow. Rose dared a glance at the man beside her, massive, quiet, eyes forward on the frozen trail. She clutched the blanket tighter, shame prickling. "You paid a fortune for me," she whispered, "but I don't understand why." Nathaniel's hands, firm on the reins, did not falter. "Because you were worth it." The words were simple, unadorned, yet they landed in her chest with a weight that made her eyes sting. They climbed higher, into the foothills where the pines grew dense and the world narrowed to white silence. At dusk, Nathaniel halted by a frozen creek, unharnessed the horses, and built a fire with swift, practiced movements. From his pack he drew bread and smoked venison, handing the larger share to Rose. "I can't take this much," she protested, cheeks hot in the firelight. "You can," he said evenly. "You've gone hungry long enough." That night she slept under a canvas shelter he rigged between two firs. He spread his own bedroll by the fire, leaving her the warmest corner, without ceremony, without demand. The wind howled, but Rose lay awake, staring at the shadows of branches above her, feeling safer than she ever had in the stone walls of St. Agatha's. Days blurred into a rhythm of snow and silence. Rose's body ached from the cold and the climb, yet each time she stumbled, Nathaniel was there, steadying her elbow, lifting her onto the wagon seat, wrapping his coat around her shoulders without a word. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. Respect, protection, an unspoken promise that she was not alone. On the third evening, as the fire cracked and the horses nickered softly nearby, Rose found her voice. "You barely know me. Why do you care what becomes of me?" Nathaniel's gaze held hers, green eyes reflecting the flames. "Because no one should be thrown away, and because I see more in you than you see in yourself." For the first time, Rose felt something thaw inside her chest, something that had been frozen for 19 long years. By the time the wagon creaked into Whitehorn Valley, Rose thought she must be dreaming. She had never seen land so wide, so fiercely beautiful. Snowdrifts gleamed like silver under the sun, and the mountains rose behind them, guardians carved of stone. At the valley's heart stood a cabin, no, a fortress of timber and stone, its chimney trailing smoke, its windows glowing like amber eyes in the frost. "This is home," Nathaniel said simply, reining in the horses. Inside, warmth wrapped around her like a long-forgotten embrace. The hearth roared with fire, filling the air with the scent of pine resin. Bears' pelts softened the floors. Shelves held rows of books and jars, and the long table bore the marks of a craftsman's hand. Then Nathaniel pushed open a smaller door, revealing a chamber prepared with astonishing care. A bed piled with quilts, curtains stitched with bright patterns, a wooden chest at its foot. Rose pressed a hand to her mouth. "This is for me?" He nodded, suddenly looking almost shy despite his size. "I built it hoping one day someone would share this place with me, not as a servant, as family." In the weeks that followed, Rose's life unfolded like spring after a long winter. She swept the hearth, kneaded bread, learned the rhythm of caring for cattle and horses. She sang softly while cooking, her voice uncertain at first, then stronger as the days passed. Even the wolves Nathaniel had raised from pups circled her with gentle loyalty. Small courtesies broke her heart and mended it at once. Nathaniel always filled her bowl before his own. He left firewood stacked by her door before dawn. He showed her how to split kindling with his axe, guiding her hands with a patience that made her cheeks burn. At night, when the wind clawed at the shutters, he sat across the fire from her, carving wood, mending tools, his quiet presence a shield stronger than any wall. Rose, once mocked for her size and clumsiness, found herself growing lighter inside. She laughed when the calves licked her hands, blushed when Nathaniel complimented her cooking, and for the first time believed she might have worth beyond labor. The girl sold for nothing at the orphanage was becoming a woman who could lift her chin and meet a man's gaze without shame. And Nathaniel watched her with eyes that softened each day, as though in her laughter he had found something he had been missing all his life. The winter passed slowly, each day weaving Rose deeper into the rhythm of Whitehorn Ranch. She woke with the sun, tended chickens, baked bread, and learned to ride the sturdy mountain ponies Nathaniel raised. For the first time, she felt wanted, not as a servant, not as a burden, but as herself. Yet even as laughter began to belong in her mouth, shadows from the past crept closer. One night, while the wind rattled the shutters, Nathaniel spoke of his own scars. He had once fought in the war, he told her, had seen blood-soaked fields and men he called brothers buried beneath it. He had returned to find his family gone, his land seized, and the world suspicious of a man with Cherokee blood. So he turned his back on towns and their petty judgments. "The mountain," he said, staring into the fire, "was the only place that let me breathe." Rose sat quietly, heart aching. She saw in him the same loneliness she had known, his isolation a different prison, but no less real. At last she shared her own truth. She told him of nights locked in the orphanage cellar, punished for eating too much bread, of the cruel laughter when her dress split at the seams, of believing for years that she was worthless, unlovable, destined only for labor until she broke. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she forced the words out. "When no one bid for me, I thought it proved them right, that I truly was nothing." Nathaniel leaned forward, rough hand warm against hers. His gaze held no pity, only fierce conviction. "You are not nothing, Rose. You're more precious than any treasure I could ever bring down from these mountains. The fools who couldn't see it, that's their shame, not yours." But beyond the walls of the cabin, danger stirred. Mother Agnes had not been content with her sack of gold. Greedy tongues wagged in Bitter Creek, and soon she learned the truth, that Nathaniel Thornfield was wealthier than anyone guessed, with land, herds, and gold hidden in the hills. Enraged that she had let such fortune slip through her fingers, she sought out Cornelius Blackthorne, a sly attorney known for twisting laws into weapons. Together, they hatched a plan to claim that Rose, at 19, was still the property of St. Agatha's until her 21st birthday. And so, one bitter morning, a sheriff rode up the mountain trail with papers in hand and Mother Agnes smiling coldly at his side. The knock came like a gunshot against the cabin door. Nathaniel rose, rifle in hand, as Rose's heart lurched. When he opened it, the wind blew in 3 figures. Sheriff Yates with his badge glinting, Cornelius Blackthorne wrapped in a lawyer's coat slick with snow, and Mother Agnes, her eyes sharp as shards of ice. "By order of Bitter Creek," Yates declared, waving the folded papers, "Rosalind O'Brien is to be returned to St. Agatha's. She remains under guardianship until her 21st year. Harboring her here is unlawful." Rose froze. The words struck like chains sliding back around her wrists. But before she could speak, Nathaniel stepped forward, broad as the doorway, voice calm but edged with steel. "She is no one's property. I pay gold to secure her freedom, and she chooses to be here." Blackthorne smirked, his thin lips curling. "A young girl cannot know her own mind. This so-called freedom is nothing more than your coercion. The law is clear. She belongs to the orphanage until she comes of age." Mother Agnes folded her hands with feigned piety. "I only want to save her soul. This arrangement is a sin." Something inside Rose snapped. She had spent 19 years bowing her head, swallowing her voice. But now, standing in the cabin Nathaniel had given her, surrounded by warmth and respect, she felt the fire of every humiliation blaze into courage. She stepped forward, chin high. "No, I will not go back. For 19 years you told me I was worthless, that I was too big, too hungry, too unlovable. But here I've found a life, a home, and a man who sees me as treasure, not burden. I am not your property. I am not your shame. I am mine." The sheriff faltered, shifting uneasily. Blackthorne opened his mouth, but Nathaniel's voice rumbled over him like thunder. "If any man here believes he can drag her from this place against her will, he'll have to go through me first." The rifle in his hands was steady, but it was his eyes that stilled the room. Green fire, unyielding. The silence stretched, broken only by the howl of the wind. Then, from behind the sheriff, voices rose, neighbors who had followed the party up the mountain, curious at first, then furious when they heard Rose's testimony. Former orphans stepped forward, children Agnes had mistreated, now grown enough to tell their truths. They shouted of hunger, of beatings, of nights locked in cold rooms. The sheriff's face hardened. He lowered the warrant, crumpling it in his fist. "I won't enforce this," he said, voice low. "Not for her, not for you." He turned to Agnes and Blackthorne. "You've twisted the law too long. Bitter Creek will hear the truth now." Agnes sputtered. Blackthorne cursed, but their power withered under the weight of so many witnesses. When they stormed back down the trail, their defeat tasted sweeter to Rose than any freedom she had ever dreamed. Nathaniel set the rifle aside, turning to her. "You stood tall," he murmured, pride rough in his voice. "No one will ever silence you again." Rose's tears spilled, but they were not tears of fear. For the first time in her life, they were tears of triumph. When the echoes of that confrontation faded, the cabin settled into quiet once more. Snow fell soft outside, covering the tracks of horses and men as though the mountain itself wished to erase the trespass. Inside, firelight painted the walls in amber, and for the first time Rose felt the chains of her past break clean away. She sat by the hearth, hands still trembling, when Nathaniel laid a steaming mug of tea before her. He crouched beside her chair, his great frame lowered so his eyes could meet hers. "You're safe here," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than any oath sworn in court. "This is your home, if you'll have it. Not because I freed you, not because I bought you from their cruelty, but because you chose to stay." Rose pressed a hand to her lips, tears spilling over. The girl who once stood unwanted on an auction block, who had been called a burden all her life, now sat in a cabin where every log and stone seemed to whisper, "You belong." Her voice shook, but she found the courage to answer. "Yes, this is home. You are home." Nathaniel's hand closed gently over hers, rough and warm, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. No law, no cruelty, no cold judgment from the town could reach them here. Only the fire, only the snow, only the fragile, powerful beginning of something neither of them had dared hope for. The cabin glowed against the storm, holding two souls who had been cast aside, now found in each other a place of refuge. Yet outside those walls, the world still waited, with its trials and whispers. The question lingered in the air like the smoke curling toward the rafters. Would their love be strong enough to withstand the harsh eyes of society beyond Whitehorn Mountain? Rose's story is a reminder that even in the harshest winters, even in a world quick to judge and discard, love can take root where no one expects it. A girl once unwanted, sold for less than a day's wages, found her worth in the eyes of a man who saw treasure where others saw burden. And together they built a home not out of stone and timber alone, but out of dignity, trust, and hope. Every time I tell a story like this, I'm reminded how much we all long to be seen for who we truly are. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Which corner of the world do you call home? And if you still believe that true love can bloom against all odds, that kindness can defy cruelty, then stay with me. The next story may be the one your heart has been waiting to hear.